Well, hey there, entrepreneurs. Welcome to 30 days of the Canon M50. If you haven't already downloaded the free PDF guide on the first video, that's just about a minute long, make sure you go back to the beginning of the series, get that free PDF on the best settings for video for the Canon M50. But otherwise, let's jump into today's video. Hey, what's up guys, and welcome back to the Canon M50 series for video. So I got a question on a recent video, and it's from Mark Anthony Golpo, and he basically says, request number 1, a tutorial in setting up a right exposure in video making using the M50, and number 2, using 4K video manual focus in video making. Mark, those are 2 awesome requests, and I'm super pumped to jump into it. So let's get into the very first one that you're asking about right now when it comes to exposure, and then in the very next video, we'll talk about getting that 4K down pat. So let's jump into it. So there is a little bit of some tech knowledge when it comes to getting proper exposure. Now, I learned exposure from Jared Polin Best, and he did that for me in his 3 shots or less video series. And what that series is basically, and I would encourage you to definitely check it out, is that it is in 3 photos or less, wanting to make sure that based off of whatever movement is happening or whatever shot that it is or look that you're wanting to get, that you're able to get the right exposure the first time, and knowing how to use the exposure triangle. And what the exposure triangle is basically it has 3 components. It is your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. Now, I talked about these a little bit in the previous video that I did, and I'll link that up above, where we are talking about the actual lenses and how that comes into play when you're talking about, getting the right focal range and making sure that it looks right. But just to touch on that a little bit here, just so that you're aware, because this is what exposure is based off of, is the shutter speed, which is basically, if I waved my hand like this, how much motion blur are you seeing if you were to pause the video in between? Or if you paused it, would it still be looking blurry, or would it look very just staccato and you just basically see it looking like this on that particular frame? And so that's what shutter speed deals with. It deals with the motion blur. Then you have the aperture, or what's also known as the f-stop. And what that is going to, based on if you have like what's called the eye of the lens, so to speak, or the iris, and you have blades that'll come down and you'll be able to barely see through that. If you're looking through, if my eye is the sensor and it's looking through the lens, those blades have come down and it can't really see or let in that much light. The same can be said of a lens and a camera and how that works together. And so when it's closed down, those numbers are much bigger, and so it's letting in less light. I don't know why it's backwards like that, but that's how it is. Now, in reverse, if we were to open up those blades and let more light in onto the sensor, imagining it being my eyeball, then it lets in way more light. And at that point, on your camera and on those settings, you'll see that that number is lower. And you'll also hear, if you're watching any kind of photography or videography videos, they will basically say like a prime lens is a fast lens, or this lens is a fast lens. And I would always wonder what makes it fast. And they're basically classifying it as fast is if it has that lower aperture number, if it gets down to f1.4, f2.0, or something like that. Anything at maybe 3.5 or f4.0 or higher, then you're getting at what's called a slower lens or something like that. And basically, it's just not able to let in as much light. So that's what your aperture, or the f-stop, is going to be dealing with. And then you have that final component of the exposure triangle, and that is the ISO, or the ISO. ISO or ISO, same thing. What that is dealing with artificial light. The lens and the sensor and how good or how cheap the camera is, those things do help. And you'll say that this camera is better than this one in low light. And a lot of people tend to ask about the Canon M50, is it great in low light? Or they'll say that it's poor in low light. And the reason why they may say something like that is based off of the kit lens, or the lens that's there. You'll start to see more, movement in the shadow parts and stuff like that, if it can't handle that, or if it doesn't have the right lens that helps to let in more light. When it comes to the ISO, it is the artificial light that is added to that, once the lens has done as much as it can do, the camera has done as much as it can do, now you want to start to add in more artificial light and start to raise that up. Now, the higher this number gets, if it's getting closer to 800, 600, you're getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And then the lower it gets, then it starts to get darker. Once you get up into the very, very high ranges, some cameras, you know, they go up to like 25,000. Then it's starting to get very, very high. And then you'll start to see more sprinkles. And I'll show you an example of what that was like for when I went to Las Vegas, just trying to see if I completely pushed this camera and was pushing it, you know, everything maxed out. What would that look like? And at the high shutter speeds, and as you can see, it doesn't look that great. When you properly expose for an image, you may get some of what I'll call sprinkles in there, where you start to see some stuff, but based off of whatever story it is that you're telling or whatever's going on, it really isn't that important. And the more you learn this stuff, the more that your eyes will see it. But I've shown, you know, videos that are having some of those sprinkles in it or whatever, depending on how it's exposed, or even my series and my shorts that I do, my stop motion shorts that I do on the channel, then I'll do those. And I've done one of those in low light with a point and shoot camera that has a sensor smaller than micro four thirds. So it's very, very small. No one complained at all about that exposure or anything like that. So just know that you want to get it as best that you can, but don't freak out about it. So let's get behind the camera and I'll show you exactly what that looks like so that I get this frame. Okay, so let's get this exposure. Now, when it comes to exposure, there are three things that go into the exposure triangle. You have the aperture, you have the shutter speed, and you have the ISO. You'll be able to adjust whatever type of recording that you want, whether that's 1080p 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 1080p 60, and 4K and stuff like that. But for what I do, like I said, it's 24 frames per second, so that's what we will be at. Some things to note when it comes to the exposure triangle: whatever this number is, though, when it comes to your frame rate, recording frame rate, which is the 24 frames per second, you want to double that number for this shutter speed right here. So if you're doing 30, you want to do 60 here. If you're doing 24, then you would ideally want to do 48, but we only get 40 and 50 or 60. So the closest we can get is 50, so that's what we want to use. And even if you're doing like 120 frames per second, it continues to do like that, just for normal motion blur, so it's not super blurry or it's not super, you know, crazy looking. So that's what you want to do for that. What you ideally want to do is, when you have your frame rate set and your shutter speed set, I do not change that at all. If, depending on if you're wanting a blurry background, then you can adjust that. Well, let's take it off of auto and then you can see what it's looking like. So let's see, about right there should be okay. But if I'm adjusting this right here, the f-stop or that aperture, the higher I bring that number, the darker the image gets. So that's, if you're going to be like outdoors, it's going to be bright, then you can, you know, darken that out. And it will also make for a deeper depth of field so that everything gets in focus. And the lower you make that number, the brighter your image gets. And it will also make sure you have a shallow depth of field so that whatever you want is in focus, and then stuff behind it is getting more and more blurrier. And then the last part that we have is we have this ISO, and the lower this number is, then, you know, the 100 is good if you're like outdoors or something, but the higher this number gets, the more artificial light it continues to add, and it starts to get really, really crazy. But you don't want to use that, so let's bring that back down. Okay. So there's one other part that will be helpful, is that the camera on this little number line, so to speak, you have that larger white notch that's there. And when it's showing in the center, then that's showing you that those things, all the stuff that's in this entire frame of this image, is going to be, all the things that are in the frame will be quote unquote properly exposed. And why I say quote unquote is because the camera is making that determination. Now, if I decided that I did not like how bright that was, and if I was to be in that shot, for me personally, I would think that it's too dark, because I tend to like my scenes a little bit brighter. Some people like those very darker looking dramatic ones. So let's take it off of auto. I would put it somewhere about there. And so the camera is saying now, based off of where that line is on the bottom, or that little notch is on the bottom, it should be with that center one right there. It should be right in the middle for the camera to say that this image or this scene is properly exposed. Basically, it's accounting for these blown highlights, or those really bright parts of the scene are super duper bright. Now, for me, like I said, I would put it at about 320 if I was going to be sitting in that scene for myself, or if I wanted to use it, then that's what it would look like on the camera at 320 ISO. And that's what I would usually have it as. I tend to have mine quote unquote slightly overexposed. If we put this ISO back to auto, which is good like if you're out vlogging, then the camera is now saying that this image is properly exposed, because it's making sure that these highlights at the top here are not blown out. And that's what it's showing on that particular scene, and it's having the ISO at 125. So there are different times where, depending on your exposure for that image, like I said, I wouldn't care for that because I think it is too dark. So I'd put it more closely to even the 250 right there. It's not as bright as before, and that one looks a little bit better. So the ISO being at 250 is what I would ideally use. Now, can you change the f-stop or the aperture to adjust it? Yeah, that will make it darker. And then if we adjusted it that way and had it at f5.0, then that is what you would be looking at as well. And the camera is also saying that that is properly exposed. So there are some different things that you can do when it comes to making sure that, you know, an image is in proper exposure. But there are some times where it just is your personal preference, and I would encourage you to do some test shots based off of whatever camera you choose to buy, or if you're buying the M50 specifically, just know that that's a factor and it's helpful. I typically like to have my aperture as low as possible, simply because the lower that f-stop number is, or aperture is, the brighter that the scene will be, but it's because it's bringing in more natural light. This ISO is what would be considered artificial light, and you can start to get, you know, more grain or noise or whatever in the image, the darker the scene is and stuff like that. So I tend to want the camera to get as much normal lighting as possible, just bright natural light or whatever from the scene or area, to be hitting that sensor as much as possible. And then I would like to compensate for anything extra and bring it up slightly more or slightly less or something like that. Something else to know that's also helpful when you are actually recording the scenes for exposure is the white balance. And so while this doesn't have to do with the exposure, it does help to change the look of certain lights, and you know, you can check the manual or anything like that. So this is ambience priority, just to get the whites white. Now that's a yellowish kind of little looking light bulb, but to try to get the walls though, like you can see over here, the walls are whiter, and then this part is yellow based off of the bulb, versus if we change to a daylight type temperature, now all of that wall is looking more yellow, versus, you know, some of the other scenes, which is helpful if you're out and about. This is a shade scene, cloudy, tungsten light, which would make it more bluish kind of, to try to compensate. And so it's a lot of different ones on there. You can even do a custom. I prefer to, especially on the M50 with this setting that they have here, they have one that's an ambience priority or a white priority, depending on, you know, what I'm doing or what shots that I'm doing. I typically like this ambience priority because it lets in a little bit more color. Being someone that is brown skin, I don't want to look more pale. I just want to look my actual real skin color, and that one seems to do well by me. Other people prefer to have it not have that slightly, I guess, more yellowish look, but it will, you can just see from the difference there, it lets in more of that yellowish hue, and then that one, it kind of removes it and cools it off, so you can get just a true white looking color, especially for the walls and stuff like that. And it depends on what scene you may be recording, where you prefer, you know, if you're sitting behind a white wall, where I typically am, then I don't want that scene to look yellow and crazy. And I had that issue before, trying to record the Canon T5i and not really knowing how to change that. So that's not included with the exposure, but it is something that's super helpful just to make sure that overall the scene is not so overexposed and that it's not super underexposed. And then to make sure that you have that white balance set as well. But otherwise, that should help you out a whole lot in experiment and trying and dialing in those settings for, you know, any studio shots that you have, as well as any outdoor shots that you may have as well. So when it comes to getting the right exposure, that's pretty much all there is. You have to decide what it is that you want to, you know, maybe sacrifice. Just like I talked about those highlights being, you know, slightly blown out right there, but they aren't anything to really be focused on. I want all of this to be a bright, airy scene. I don't want it to be super dramatic or dark. But if you want those, then the camera may say one thing at times, and then you may decide that you want to do something else. But getting it as best as you can, that tick mark right in the middle, that's going to get you closer to having proper exposure on your photos, on your video. I hope that video helped you out.